Hello and welcome to the CNBC TV18 eBix Cash Studio. I'm Shireen Bhan and you're watching the GST Sentimeter. The GST Fitment Committee has proposed hiking the 5% tax slab to 7% and the 18% slab to 20%. That's not all. The committee has also proposed that the 1% compensation rate be hiked to 1.5%. The group of ministers formed to examine the issue of rate rationalization will take a view on the matter when it meets on Saturday. We will be joined by our panel of experts as we try and decode what the proposed changes could mean for businesses. But first, let's go across to my colleague Timsy Jaipuria to take us through the GST Fitment Committee's proposals. Timsy, take us through what has been suggested for the road ahead.
Well, that's right. Sources have told CNBC TV18 that the GST Council-nominated Fitment Committee has given a slew of proposals for the GST Council-nominated GOM on rate rationalization to think upon, to discuss upon before putting a final proposal on the table of the Council, which is likely to be put forward in the next Council meeting, which is expected in December. Now, the GST Fitment Committee has proposed raising GST slab of 5% to 7%, 18% to 20%, also to see feasibility of merging 12 and 18% to a single slab of 17%, also considering hiking compensation rate from 1% to 1.5%, hiking GST on precious metals, that is gold and silver, from 3% to 5%. Remember, GOM is yet to deliberate on these changes in the rate slabs. The Council is likely to take this forward once GOM makes a final view, which is likely on 27th of November, because that's the last date of meeting for the GOM to consider these proposals. GOM will submit this proposal in a totality after taking careful considerations to see that exemptions need to be phased out to avoid tax evasion. Also, implementation of rationalized rates requires careful consideration. That is a view from the GOM. They also say that reduction of 28% to 18% cannot commensurate price reduction. Also, items of public consumption, sensitive public perception is important for careful consideration during the rationalization exercise. So let's see what's the final view that GOM makes. Back to you.
All right, Timsy, many thanks. So as Timsy was pointing out, these are recommendations made by the GST Fitment Committee. These recommendations will be taken up by the GOM. Remember, the GST Council in its last meeting had constituted a GOM to look at the issue of rate rationalization. If the GOM concurs with what the Fitment Committee is saying, then they will send their report to the GST Council, and of course, a final decision will be taken by the GST Council. Joining us now to take this conversation forward is Najib Shah, the former chairman of the Central Board of Excise and Customs. Also with us, MS Money partner at Deloitte India, Abhishek Rastogi, partner at Khaitan and Company, and Prateek Jain, partner at PricewaterhouseCoopers. Gentlemen, appreciate you joining us here on the program. Mr. Shah, let me come to you. Now, at the last meeting of the GST Council, there was a decision to set up a GOM to look at rate rationalization. Now, the GOM will look at what the Fitment Committee has recommended. What we are given to understand, and this is source-based information that Timsy is picking up, that the Fitment Committee is proposing raising the GST slab of 5% to 7%, 18% to 20%, and the feasibility of merging the 12 and 18% to a single slab of 17% is yet to be examined. Now, what do you make of this broadly, sir? We've seen many rate revisions go through. The slabs have remained more or less intact, though the items under which what falls under what slab has changed significantly. There have been concerns raised by the Finance Commission, for instance, suggesting that the rates are not revenue neutral any longer. Do you believe that that would have been the guiding principle for the Fitment Committee as it went about this exercise?
I would think so, because the Finance Commission, like you rightly pointed out, has indicated the fact that the current weighted average of 11.6 is far too less from the revenue neutral rate. Now, about the suggestion and the recommendation to hike up from 5 to 7, ideally, of course, like we have all been discussing ad nauseum, we should be having 3 rates, a merit rate, a standard rate, and a demerit rate. So what we are looking at now is what we have is 5, and one was always thinking in terms of 12 and 18 merging and forming the bulk of the commodity with the 2 extremities remaining where they were. So if this 5 has indeed been recommended by the Fitment Committee to 7, I'm sure they have the reasons, but I don't know whether the GOM will go with those reasons, simply because it doesn't really look very, very politically expedient for them to go around increasing this rate from 5 to 7. I'm all for a merger of the 12 and the 18 slab and bring it to anything between 16 to 17 or whatever. And I think that will take care of a lot of the revenue considerations. And once that happens, the revenue neutral rate ideal of 15 to 17 per 16% will also be achieved largely. I'm also very much for hiking the rate on gold and silver from 3 to 5, because 3 is again a rate which is not here nor there. It's another special rate. So I do believe, I do not know whether the Fitment Committee has also looked at exemptions, because I really think pruning of it done as a way forward for rationalization.
Well, yes, as Timsy was reporting, the Fitment Committee has said, and I think that is the view of the GOM as well, that exemptions should be curtailed so that there is no tax evasion. And that is the general feeling within the Fitment Committee as well as the GOM. But of course, the GOM will meet on the 27th to firm this matter up. But Prateek, let me come to you now. As Mr. Shah was pointing out, and that was my first point as well, that are we headed towards a more revenue neutral rate, and whether 5 becoming 7 and 18 becoming 20 will achieve that? Because as Mr. Shah was pointing out, the big bone of contention and the substantive change would have been the merger of the 12 and 18. That proposal is yet to be examined. So that is not a recommendation that the Fitment Committee has made at all, at least at this stage. What do you make of these proposed changes, Prateek?
Yes, so several points. So first of all, the revenue neutral rate itself is something which is a misnomer, right, in many ways, because what revenue neutral rate was there a few years ago and what you have now could be different. You see the GST collections are increasing over the last 6 months, most of the months more than 1 lakh crore. And this has happened despite the rate reduction. So I think that increasing the tax rate, whether it's 5 to 7, 18 to 20, easier option, perhaps not desirable. I think there will be a lot of discussion which will happen in the GOM on that. As Mr. Shah was pointing out, when we talk about rationalization, we talk about merging 4 to 3, whereas 5, 12, 18, and 28 either becomes 6, 17, and 28, or whatever, 7, 16, and 28, something like that, right? If you just increase the tax rate without merging the tax slabs, then that will perhaps not be in line with what GOM has been constituted for. Now, you have to remember that in the 5% category also, there are a lot of items, right? Edible oil and, transportation and real estate and restaurant, and it will impact the common man. Even 12 to kind of, if you increase 12 and 18 and merge it to 16 or 17, there are a lot of items in the 12% category, like food items, right? Fruit juices and so on and so forth. I mean, whether you would want to increase the tax rate or not, that's a question. So I think a lot of things have to be done. My take on this is that it's just an initial discussion happening in GOM. Till now, GOM has been focused on inverted duty structure, to my mind. These discussions have not come on fore. It will take time to do the sectoral analysis, look at the products, et cetera, and what will be impact on inflation before you take a decision. But I would want to see a 3-rate structure and not necessarily the rate increase, really.
Yes, a 3-tiered structure is what everyone is keen on. As we've been pointing out, this is not the final decision. This is just the Fitment Committee's recommendations, which will be taken up by the GOM. If the GOM passes this, then it will be taken up by the GST Council. So this is not a done deal. In fact, it's a long way away from being a done deal just yet. But Mani, let me come to you now on some of the proposed changes. And as Prateek and Mr. Shah both were pointing out, it's not necessarily desirable politically either for the GST Council to consider hiking rates at this point in time. Let's take a look at what's under the 5% GST rate slab, for instance. LPG, branded milk products, oil seeds, branded fruit grains, coal, mineral, granite, marble, gypsum. I mean, these are just some of the items that fall under the 5% bracket, which the Fitment Committee is proposing to move to 7%. 18%. TV, fridge, washing machine, geyser, fans, soaps, shampoos, body wash, detergents. Again, there the proposal is to move 18 to 20%. Do you believe that we could be looking at any significant rate increase? Do you believe that there is the political appetite at this point in time to consider anything of the sort, even though that might be the recommendation?
Okay, so Shireen, the way I look at it is undoubtedly we should be having fewer rates, and we should be looking at a rate structure which has got 2 slabs or 3 slabs only. Now, that's certainly the long-term or the medium-term ambition, and no doubts on that, no two views on that. Having said that, what we also have to bear in mind is after GST was introduced, at the stage when GST was introduced, the rates on virtually all products came down. There were a few where it went up, but largely it was one where it came down. Subsequent to GST introduction, we have only seen the rates coming down. In fact, many of the 28% products were brought down to 18% or so. So today, when we look at this, if we look at it in a slightly larger perspective, as we approach GST, which is entering the 5th year, and the GST in 6 months from now will be a 5-year-old tax, is it the right time to have a relook and see are the rates the right rates for certain products? Are certain products cross-subsidizing certain other products? Would there be a business case for certain products which are, I would say, price inelastic as opposed to certain products which are price elastic? Possibly as we approach the 5th year of GST, which is not too long away, maybe this is the right time to look at the products, see how they are classified, see should certain rates be changed, should certain rates not be changed, etc. Now, we have to keep in mind that in GST, today the rates that are there are common for goods and services. So the 18% applies for virtually most of the services, excepting very few of them. And it applies to, I would say, majority of the goods. Now, in respect of services, there is possibly a good case for reducing the rate from 18% to 15, 16 or whatever, because that is one area where the rate really increased by 20% when GST got introduced. But the moment we start changing the rate of services from the rate of goods, we are again going to have rate complexity. And there would be an arbitrage between certain categories of goods and certain categories of services. So complexity and having the right rate will always pull in two different directions. The more we have simplicity, the easier it becomes, the easier it is to administer. Just one point more is this 20% rate that was mentioned now is very interesting, because a few years back, the UK moved their average VAT rate, which was our 18% equivalent there, was 17.5%. And they moved it to 20%. When they moved it to 20%, actually, in that country, everybody heaved a sigh of relief, and they said it.
Let me bring Abhishek into the conversation. Abhishek, as Mani was pointing out, we are going to be headed into the 5th year. It will also be a time when the government will have to decide, along with the GST Council, as far as the future of the compensation owed to the states is concerned and what happens after 5 years. In that context, any significant change, i.e. any rate slab revision, do you believe that that should be that should happen only as we approach the next financial year and nothing should be done currently, perhaps leave things as is, rates should be status quo at least up until next financial year? Anyway, collections are looking strong, have picked up significantly, so don't destabilize things just yet? Would that be your view?
I completely agree with that view, because rate rationalization is good. Merging products from 12% and 18% will make sense, because that will reduce the classification disputes. But I think any upward revision of rate at this stage from 3 to 5% in case of gold, or for the peak median rate from 18% to 20%, as of now, I think doesn't make too much of sense. One, because in last 4.5 years, we have seen a lot of these changes, whether these pertain to rate changes or the non-tariff changes. So industry has already gone through a lot of such changes. Of course, to broaden the tax base would remain the objective of this government. So they may trim down certain exemptions, but I think they will not reduce the tax rate at every stage. So I think what I personally feel is that at this stage, any increase in rate must be skipped for the time being. The rate rationalization between 12 and 18% may happen, and that would be the right approach.
Yeah, that would be the right approach. Mr. Shah, let me come back to you now and, discuss the possible timing, because the meeting of the GST Council is slated for December. But as Pratik was pointing out, it's unlikely that we are going to see a final decision on this matter as early as December, given the fact that, this will require perhaps detailed discussion. What would your expectation be in terms of making the transition to whatever the decisions are as far as the revision is concerned, in terms of timeline?
Look, the GOM's task is unenviable. It is going to have to convince a lot of people and get convinced itself by what the Fitment Committee is trying to tell them. So I believe that it will involve a lot of debate and discussions. The GST rates itself have nothing to do with the budget. But having said that, it will be ideal if the new rates come from the next financial year. That will help the industry. Yeah. And I think that's the way to go forward. And it's not going to happen so soon and so easily. Even pruning the exemptions is going to be very challenging. I think they have their task cut out.
Yes, they do have their task cut out. Already, some of the rate revisions that have been announced by the GST Council have been notified and are now coming into existence. We've already got apparel makers, textile makers up in arms, for instance, saying that the environment is not conducive to move to a higher GST rate. Mani, just today, representations being sent to the government, for instance, by textile and apparel makers when it comes to the new rates. So how challenging will this be for the GST Council to move forward with any changes? And do you anticipate any U-turns on some of the changes that have already been notified?
Oh, yes. And I would say that from a rate policy perspective or from an industry perspective, we should certainly keep rate changes to the minimum. And we should make rate changes during the year only when it is absolutely warranted, when we have no choice but to do that change. Otherwise, as Mr. Shah was suggesting, we should possibly have a discussion on the rate. We should be looking at products, and that has to be an ongoing exercise. But the rate changes should ideally be brought in at the beginning of the financial year. Because when there is a rate change, there is an enormous amount of work that the impacted businesses have to undertake. Now, whether it is in terms of their pricing, whether it is in terms of their supply chains, whether it is in terms of their input tax credit, there is a lot of work that goes on, in respect of any rate change. In the past, since the GST was a new tax, we had frequent and not so frequent rate changes for the first 2 years or so. Last 1.5 years, we have normally not seen too many rate changes. Even pre-pandemic, the rate change, mantra had stabilized. Now, we shouldn't be getting back into it now. And therefore, when we look at a rate change, now in the case of textiles that you mentioned, that was largely brought out by the fact that the inverted duty structure was a very compelling reason for them to make an alteration. But even there, the rates have been brought into effect only from a prospective date. That is 1st Jan 22. So people have some time to prepare for it.
Correct.
But it would be wonderful if we can have it mandated that all rate changes in GST unrelated to the budget will be brought into force only from 1st April of every year. Even if the discussion happens in course of the year, it will be wonderful to see that.
Right. Right. So some consistency and less frequent changes. Pratik, let me give you the final say before we close. Of course, the meeting of the GOM is on the 27th and the GST Council will meet on some date in December. We don't have a date just yet. But what do you think will be the sort of more driving pillars of the conversations when the GOM meets?
I personally think that discussion will perhaps be more centered around inverted duty structure and what are those products where, just like textile, etc., that we talked about earlier. I think maybe a few options at a broad level might be discussed about, merging the slabs and things like that. But I think Group of Ministers needs much more time. I also think that the Group of Ministers should engage with industry bodies, industry associations to take feedback. It's a big decision which everyone is taking. Couple of more points. I think GOM should resist, sort of looking at making this GST policy a little inconsistent. So what will be, GST is a value-added tax. We should refrain from having a tax based on the MRP of the product or the pack size of the product and so on. So that's one clear thing. The second thing is, many times when you look at inverted duty structure, textile, for example, 5 to 12, An easier option to deal with that would also be to allow the refund of inverted duty. Today, the problem is that for services, whatever GST I pay, that is not allowed as a refund in case of inverted duty structure. With one change in legislation, they can deal with inverted duty structure in a different manner, rather increasing the tax rate at every point in time. And therefore, that is one thing which they must discuss as part of the larger deliberation. They should take time before a final decision is taken. Certainly not a good idea from 18 to 20 and so on. If you remember 2011, when the first time GST was being conceptualized, the revenue neutral rate at that point in time, eventual revenue rate was 16% is what was contemplated. I think 15, 16, 17% as a revenue neutral rate or whatever standard rate is an ideal situation for a country like us. We should not compare our tax structure with what used to happen pre-GST. That's a trap that we all fall into. It's a new tax, a new regime, and we should look at moving this country forward rather than sort of looking at what used to happen 25 years ago, because what used to happen 25 years ago or even 5 years ago was not an ideal situation.
Yes, it wasn't an ideal situation, and we're hoping that it will be less complex, much more simpler as we move forward. What the decision will be of the GOM, we cannot preempt that just yet, but we will keep you updated here on CNBC TV18. Najib Shah, MS Pani, Abhishek Rastogi and Prateek Jain, many thanks for joining us here on the GST Sentimeter. We will take a break. There's a lot more coming up. Don't go anywhere. We're back in a moment.